Thank you to my colleagues for letting me jump ahead. I appreciate it very, very much. I want to see if I've got this right. We're going to train people inside of Syria to fight ISIL rather than training them outside of Syria. Equip them inside and train them inside, right? New strategy.
Yes, that's where they are.
Okay, so, count me in for trying to help. Do we still want to replace Assad?
Oh, absolutely. I think
is that a goal of ours?
Yes, a transition from Assad to a government of Syria that is inclusive and moderate and together. Absolutely.
Right, General Dunford. Is it smart to let Russia fight ISIL and we stay out of the fight?
Russia's not fighting ISIL, Senator.
But that wouldn't be a good idea to rely on Russia to fight ISIL for us.
Senator, I think we need to be engaged in advancing our own national interest. We have a national interest in dealing with ISIL, and we should be doing that.
Okay, here's the question.
Do it more effectively. I'm not confident that Russia is effective at doing that.
I'm 1,000,000% with you. Are we going to supply air support for the people we train to fight ISIL?
We are, Senator.
Do those same people want to take Assad down?
The ones that we are supporting right now are focused on ISIL. Senator.
Do they have a goal to take Assad down?
Senator, I don't know.
What do you mean you don't know?
Well, the ones we're supporting, I don't know because the folks.
Don't you think most people in Syria want two things? They want to fight, they want to destroy ISIL and get rid of Assad, the person who's killed 250,000 of their family? Is that really a mystery?
No, it's not.
It's not a mystery. Okay, is Russia going to fight for Assad?
Russia is fighting for Assad.
Will Iran fight for Assad?
They are doing that, Senator.
Will Hezbollah fight for Assad?
They are doing that.
When the people we train to fight ISIL turn on Assad, which they surely will, are we going to fight with them to replace Assad?
I can't answer that question, Senator.
Can you answer it, Secretary Carter?
Yeah, just to be clear, let's take the...
That day is coming.
PG Kurds.
Do you see a scenario where the people in Syria don't take on Assad?
The people that we are equipping are people who live in or come from ISIL-occupied territory, and they're.
Do they want to take Assad down?
On defeating ISIL and.
Do they want to take Assad down?
For the most part, they're focused on defeating.
Do they want to take Assad? Have you asked them?
We know what their intent is, and it is to fight ISIL.
Come on.
They're fighting ISIL now.
You know as well as I do, both of you know, that the average Syrian not only wants to destroy ISIL, but they're intent on destroying Assad because he's killed 250,000 of them. And here's the question for this committee. How do we leverage Assad leaving when Russia's going to fight for him, Iran's going to fight for him, Hezbollah's fight for him, and we're not going to do a damn thing to help people take him down? And y'all both know that. So when Kerry goes over to Geneva, he is turning over Syria to the Russians and to the Iranians. Is there any credible military threat to Assad now that Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah is on his side? Do you see any credible military threat to take him down, General Dunford?
I think the balance of forces right now are in Assad's advantage.
Not his advantage. He is secure as the day is long. So this is what's happened, folks. This strategy is completely falling apart. Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah are going to fight for their guy, and we're not going to do a damn thing to help the people who want to change Syria for the better by getting rid of the dictator in Damascus. Do you see a scenario, Secretary Carter, where we would fight to support an effort to take Assad down, that we would fight alongside of people who want to take Assad down in Syria? Is that remotely possible?
Our approach to removing Assad has been to...
Does it have a military component?
It is principally a political effort in Syria.
So the answer is no.
Our military effort.
Are we going to fight with people who want to take Assad down? Are we going to provide them military help?
Our train and equip program.
The answer is no. The answer is no.
Supportive of people who are fighting ISIL.
Let me just end this. If I'm Assad, this is a good day for me, because the American government has just said, without saying it, that they're not going to fight to replace me. The Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah, this is a really good day for them because their guy has no military credible threat. So now you tell me what kind of deal we're going to get, folks. I'm sure we'll get a really good deal with this construct. So what you've done, gentlemen, along with the president, is you've turned Syria over to Russia and Iran. You've told the people in Syria who died by the hundreds of thousands, we're more worried about a political settlement than we are about what follows. All I can say, this is a sad day for America, and the region will pay hell for this because the Arabs are not going to accept this.
It's good to be with you, and glad to speak to your audience around the world.
We definitely appreciate that. We were just talking, and there certainly is a lot going on in the world. There's so much to talk about. I don't really know exactly where to start, so I think we should just jump right into it. I wanted to talk about some of the recent events that have happened, something that I know the viewers would be very interested in, something I've been looking at over the last couple weeks, and that's the developments that have been happening in Yemen. And there was a recent report that came out, it was just a couple days ago, that Britain has licensed over $6 billion worth of military equipment and has supplied over 166 personnel to assist Saudi armed forces, including several officers deployed in the Air Force control room advising on targeting. What exactly is going on in Yemen? The attacks have been large scale when you consider the strength of Saudi Arabia and the population of Yemen. What's UK doing involved in all this?
Well, we have to go back a couple of years to when Yemen was in fact part of the same coalition as Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Turkey and Israel in basically funding and supplying arms and munitions to terrorists, U.S.-backed terrorists in Syria. And then when the U.S. created ISIS, it was actually a combination between U.S. and British intelligence. They took about half of the U.S.-backed terrorists in Syria and said, you're now called ISIS. It was simply a name change. They gave them priority on weapons, sent them on a crusade into Iraq, and all of this was basically to have an excuse to get back into Syria. Now, I'll come back to the Iran-Syria situation later, but essentially, Yemen came into information on behalf of Iran that the U.S. was in fact backing terrorism and not fighting ISIS, that it was a fraud, actually. And so Yemen decided to switch sides and to stop backing the U.S. war on terror, which they believed was a fraud.
The U.S. and Yemen, they're telling very different stories about what Yemen knew ahead of time and what the U.S. can do now. Who is giving accurate information here?
Well, clearly, Jake, some Yemeni officials and leaders were upset with the results of this raid. It's natural. There were a number, perhaps as many as 24 civilian casualties. Some of them were children. The images of the civilian casualties circulating across the internet in their country and around the world. Tonight, Yemen condemning the deadly U.S. raid on an AQAP compound last month. Yemeni officials tell CNN it is now requesting that all future U.S. operations come only with the approval of the Yemeni government. Yemen's criticism of the raid comes as the country is included on a list of countries whose people are temporarily banned from entering the United States, with potentially damaging effects on a key U.S. counterterror partnership.
Between the executive order and then 24 hours later, a failed raid in Yemen, it just became unsustainable for the country to essentially cooperate with the United States anymore.
And that's when the government was overthrown, and that's when Saudi Arabia began to attack Yemen with a vengeance. And that attack has had tremendous humanitarian issues. It's been a savage attack. It's been one-sided. And a lot of this, of course, is because there's a proxy war going on between Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Britain against Iran. The reason Iran is in the target of the globalists is because they're the only Muslim country that is approaching the ability to become self-sufficient in weaponry. And they cannot allow that. Ever since World War I, the Muslims, Arabs, and Persians in Iran have been cannon fodder for Western society. Made them promises. The French made promises to Syria. The British made promises to Saudi Arabia. And they broke all those promises. Well, a special deal took place after large deposits of oil were discovered in Saudi Arabia. The Arabians were actually a very corrupt set of leaders and involved in everything from child trafficking to pedophilia to, sex slaves were brought in around the world. And when they nationalized the Aramco and other Western oil interests, the U.S. basically came in and said, we can take you down at any time. We will preserve you as a kingdom if you'll give us a complete and steady supply of oil using U.S. dollars in exchange. And in the meantime, we'll protect you from any uprisings within your country. So you notice there was no orange revolution. There was no colored revolution in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain like there was in Egypt and Libya. And so Saudi Arabia has for many, many years been a puppet state of the United States and British intelligence in terms of funding the war on terror. It started in Afghanistan with the funding of Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen. They became the terrorists of choice to be able to, basically create conflict and overthrow governments. Now, Al-Qaeda was the watchword for many, many years in the war on terror. And then all of a sudden, it's very, very strange that Al-Qaeda disappears and suddenly ISIS is the main enemy.
Sure.
This is how this happened. And I only know this because there was what I call an accidental visitor to a high-level meeting in the City of London. Now, the City of London is not the metropolitan area of London. It's a small financial center in the middle of London. It's the ancient walled city of London.
Okay.
This is where the Anglo-American establishment has always held power. A lot of that power has been transferred to New York because of the power of America in the Federal Reserve in terms of keeping international funding alive. But still, a lot of globalist decisions are made in the City of London. And there was once in 2006 a high-level financier who was dealing in a lot of the financial aspects of the City of London, and he got invited to a meeting. As soon as he got into the meeting, he realized, I don't belong here. I don't even know what the people are talking about. But apparently, because he was so high into the financial levels, someone invited him to me thinking he must be in the know. He must be part of the in-group, but he wasn't. So we heard them starting to talk about Russia and China and Israel and Iran and the various conflicts going around the world. And they realized this is not a financial meeting. This is not something I'm supposed to be. He didn't leave. One of the things that he told about, though, was that they mentioned how displeased they were that Israel, which had been tasked since 2004 to attack Iran, had not yet done so.
Okay.
And how displeased they were. One of the other participants said the reason Israel has not done this is because they fear Syria. Syria has thousands of Scud missiles and chemical weapons. They know they could overwhelm their missile defense systems. So they basically told us they're not going to attack Iran until you take care of Syria. So from that meeting on, the globalists tasked the United States to take down Syria. And within a month, the U.S. declared that Syria had used chemical weapons on its own civilians in Damascus. That was the Ghouta suburb, which is now under attack by the U.S.-backed rebels.
Yes.
And it wasn't true, of course. But they needed a chemical weapons excuse to attack Syria.
Now,
So the US
Mr. Skousen, I don't want to cut you off there, but what is true in that case? Have you got any information whether that was an Israeli false flag or a U.S. false flag or Turkey or who?
Well, it actually, one of the U.S.-backed rebels admitted to an Arab radio station that they had received the chemical weapons from Saudi Arabia. And so this was part of a black operation, a false flag operation to blame the Assad regime. And so they set up a no-fly zone, and as everyone knew from Libya, a no-fly zone meant nobody can fly except the U.S. and NATO.
Sure.
And they were attacking, not just defending against anyone else flying. They were throwing in Libya, for example, they sent in cruise missiles to attack. They sent in special forces. They did radio jamming. They did everything they could to destroy the Libyan Air Force and so that the rebels could win. That's what they were going to do in Syria. Then John Kerry got before, this was 3.5 years ago, got before a London press conference, and one savvy reporter asked him, it's obvious that you're going to attack Syria. Is there anything that Syria can do to stop you from attacking? And just off the top of his head, he said, well, they could give up their chemical weapons and we wouldn't attack. And immediately Syria said, we accept.
They backed off.
And Russia said, we accept on behalf of Syria. I can tell you that John Kerry got a tongue lashing you wouldn't want to hear when he got off the stage that day. You fool, they said, you just ruined it. You ruined our excuse to go into Syria. But remember from what I'm telling you that the ultimate target was Iran. And that's why the U.S. had 3 or 4 carrier groups, 3 carrier groups off the coast of Iran, constantly threatening an attack. You notice there was no such threat to North Korea in those days. That was the dichotomy. North Korea had nuclear weapons, had missiles, but no threat of military, no regime change. And yet Iran was constantly under threat until 2007. In 2007, Ron Paul was running for the Republican nomination on a very anti-globalist intervention policy. And Iran was the top of the list of globalist intervention to stop their so-called nuclear program. So in 2007, in response to Ron Paul's running for president, which the globalists really feared, because there really was an anti-intervention feeling in the United States, the CIA came out with its National Intelligence Estimate, the NIE, and suddenly they said Iran doesn't have a nuclear program. I mean, as a political scientist, I just blinked my eyes and said, what did you say? After saying for years that Iran has a nuclear program and we're going to attack, they don't have any. Well, then the Republican Party went to work on Ron Paul and sabotaged the primary so that he couldn't win. As soon as Ron Paul was out of the picture, not running for president anymore, the 2008 National Intelligence Estimate, NIE, came out and said, oh, Iran does have a nuclear weapon. And now the attacks are on again. That was only stopped when Israel basically was tasked. Israel was tasked to attack with a few aircraft Iran's nuclear facilities so that Iran would retaliate against U.S. troops and against Israel, which would give the U.S. an excuse to obliterate Iran's military. They did not want to invade Iran. They just wanted to, they were planning on obliterating their infrastructure and their military to bring Iran to its knees. But you see, Israel's demand that the U.S. take out Syria before they attack Iran is what caused this no-fly zone. That's what caused the press conference. And the chemical weapons agreement, which Syria complied with, and which international inspectors agreed they had complied, suddenly meant that the U.S. had no reason to intervene in Syria. They were out of luck. And that's when they had to create ISIS. And isn't it interesting that 3.5 years ago, suddenly you'd never heard anything more about Al-Qaeda, or very rarely. Everything was ISIS. 50, 60,000 men came out of nowhere.
I want to get to that here in a second, but I want to focus on something that's very important so we can maybe catch some of the viewers up to speed with what you're talking about. I think it's very important. When you're talking, we were talking about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, okay, and how this could bring Iran into the fight, and how they want to bring Iran into the fight. Are they trying to link this war on Yemen with Iranian missiles? I've heard this a lot in the news where they're saying that a missile fired into Riyadh and it's been linked to Iran. Are they trying to do something where they draw Hezbollah out so they can wage a war on Hezbollah and link that to Iran? What exactly are they doing there? And when you're talking about this globalist war on Iran, I also want you to go into a little bit, I think it's very important, this new Middle East project that everybody has been talking about, something that was set up, it looked like before 9/11, but it definitely got pushed pretty hard after 9/11 when General Wesley Clark mentioned this 7 countries in 5 years, which it looks like it's taken a little bit more than 5 years, but he was mentioning Libya and Syria and Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, and then he said then they would end with Iran. And when you look at the events that's taken place in Iraq and with Libya, and obviously a lot of people don't hear about it, but we know Sudan's a mess, and Somalia, now Syria, and then going in what looks like this kind of push towards Iran. Does this all have to do with that? Is that new Middle East project that was pushed by Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice and Bush and Cheney and all these, is that part of that globalist plan that you're talking about?
It is. As I said at the beginning of this, Iran has always been the target because Saudi Arabia is a puppet state already. Bahrain is a puppet state. Turkey is now between Russia and the United States deciding which way to go or playing both sides of it. Israel is a puppet state of the globalists. Jordan is a puppet state of the globalists. Qatar is a puppet state of the globalists. Yemen used to be, and they are no longer. Lebanon, Syria, Yemen are now in the camp of Iran, and they realize that the real enemies are the globalists. It's not the Yemenis linked to Iran that is the big thing. It's the fact that Iran is supporting militarily the Yemeni government right now. And so, yes, they did blame the missile that was fired against Saudi Arabia and intercepted. They blamed that on Iran, and it probably, might have been. The point is that Iran is the only one that is fighting this globalist agenda in the Middle East, and so more and more nations are now deciding, hey, I'm going to back Iran, and that is even accelerating the globalist hatred of Iran. And what we're seeing right now is Israel is starting to set the stage for a major attack on Syria, justifying that it's going to be an Iranian base, Iranian militia and other, or at least Iranian-backed militias are in Syria helping Bashar al-Assad try to gain back territory. They're helping Yemen. They're, of course, supporting Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is supporting Assad in Syria. So clearly, this is a major proxy war building up. The U.S. won't be directly involved yet, but Israel, I believe, within the next month or so, you're going to see a major attack on Hezbollah, on Syria, under the excuse of fighting Iran.
Israel is believed to have just carried out massive airstrikes in Syria. Arab media is reporting that Israeli jets have been spotted launching missiles at an Iranian military base near Al-Kiswa, allegedly destroying an arms depot. Israel, as a rule, doesn't comment on military activity like this, but Prime Minister Netanyahu has just issued a warning directly to Iran, unofficially confirming that Israel was behind the attack. We will not allow a regime hell-bent on the annihilation of the Jewish state to entrench itself militarily in Syria. That's a promise from Netanyahu.
So Saudi Arabia feels like, Iran and Saudi Arabia have this major tension, but it really is because Saudis are a puppet for the globalist states, not because there's any real tension beside them. I mean, they're a corrupt nation, and being supposedly the host of Muslim relics and ancient history, being the hypocrites that they are, the immoral pedophiles that the Saudi royal family is, the Iranians are livid about that. And they legitimately want to take Saudi Arabia out of the, being the hero of the Muslim religion. So there's religious aspects, but most of it is Iran is the only one. I'm saying they are allied. Russia is helping out in this situation too, because they too realize that the U.S. has falsified the war on terror. And they moved into Syria, which was a counter to their normal doctrine. Remember, they had a mutual assistance pact with Iraq, and yet they let the U.S. attack Iraq without coming to the aid of Iraq. And part of that was because they wanted to eavesdrop on U.S. military tactics and electronics, especially, to develop countermeasures to those. They also wanted to try out certain special military innovations. They have a special anti-tank missile about the size of a pencil that just drills a hole through the armor of a missile, and that was used in Iraq against a U.S. tank and killed it. So there were a lot of reasons to stay in the background in Iraq, but they decided to intervene in Syria to embarrass the U.S. about this war, this claim that they were fighting a war on terror. That's why the Russians bombed this oil convoy parked at the border with Turkey waiting to get in. And after they bombed it, they said to the U.S., now this is what you should be doing. This is ISIS oil. They've been lining up week after week, importing oil into Turkey, and Turkey is marketing that to Israel.
Massive convoys, Joel. I saw videos where and we're going to show that right now, just truck after truck after truck of black market ISIS oil flowing in and out of Turkey, and it was confirmed that this was going directly to, correct me if I'm wrong, it was Erdogan's family. Is that correct?
Well, they were involved in the marketing of that, but it really went to Israel. Israel was purchasing most of this oil.
Okay.
But yes, Erdogan's family was the marketing agent for this, and Israel was buying. Now, after the U.S. was embarrassed, the U.S. made one attack on an oil convoy, dropped leaflets in advance so that none of the truck drivers were killed. They destroyed one convoy, and that's the last time they ever bombed an ISIS convoy. What the U.S. did do throughout the war against ISIS was bomb buildings and other things that Navy pilots would, of course, think were real targets, but they had also, just like the truck drivers, alerted them prior to the attack so that these buildings were empty and the camps were empty. This is the way that the U.S. would fight Israel, so that their actual soldiers, the people on the ground who were shelling or fighting, didn't realize it, but they had been forewarned in advance. And part of the way that they do that is because many of the ISIS leaders were Mossad, Israeli-trained Arabs, Israeli Arabs that live in Israel, that are working for the Mossad. They're trained, and they're the best infiltrators into every Arab government in the Middle East. They've done it for years. And what they do is they train these leaders to go and become the leaders over these ISIS groups, so that the terrorists themselves do not know that they're working for U.S. and British intelligence. But the leaders do. And they are the ones who get the orders. They're the ones who are rescued. The Iraqi parliament was shown videos of U.S. helicopters resupplying ISIS. Of course, the Iraqi government was complaining to the Obama administration about these 2 or 3 large weapons depots that were being stockpiled in Iraq prior to the attack on Mosul. They asked the U.S. to attack these depots, and the Obama administration refused. When ISIS had a large victory parade down a major highway after taking control of Mosul, U.S. Navy pilots were prohibited from attacking that convoy. They were sitting ducks. So time after time, ISIS has been protected rather than really attacked. And the U.S. in Mosul left open a sector in Mosul so that ISIS fighters could escape rather than be trapped. In Raqqa, the final battle of ISIS, the U.S. paid for the truck convoys which took out ISIS fighters, their families, and their heavy weapons back into Syria, leaving Raqqa. I believe now that ISIS has been reintegrated into the ranks of U.S.-backed rebels, and that's why you won't hear much about ISIS anymore. And this is largely due to the Russian intervention in Syria, where they have embarrassed the U.S., forcing the U.S. to actually make sure that ISIS is reduced, and now reduced to a complete reintegration within the U.S.-backed rebels. And so there really never was any difference between the U.S.-backed rebels in Syria and ISIS, except for the fact that ISIS was trained to create hatred in all the world. In other words, the war on terror was kind of fading many, many years after 9/11. Everybody was claiming to be Al-Qaeda. It was ho-hum. But now you needed a new ruthlessness in the war on terror, and that's why they started to stage those beheading videos, all the orange jumpsuits killing people. If you'll notice one thing about those videos of the journalists that were killed by ISIS, you analyze them very carefully, it's very obvious that this is a fake. First of all, they're giving a confession about ISIS and how good they are. And they say during this, every journalist that is beheaded here says, we know we're going to die, but I want to say this about, well, if you know you're going to die, why give this confession? We're not going to believe that these journalists really converted to ISIS. So if you're really going to die, why give the confession? And then the most telling thing, though, is that as the knife goes to the throat, they never flinch.
Of course.
If you look in those videos, not one of those journalists flinch when the knife goes to their throat.
And we'll pull one of those up right now while you're talking about that.
And what that means is that these journalists knew that this was a faked video. And they were told before this video, you read this script, here's what I think happened. I think U.S. and British intelligence rescued these journalists from terrorists. And then they told them, now before we send you back home, we want you to do a propaganda video about ISIS to help us in this war, to make ISIS look bad. And they're going to fake a beheading of you, and they're going to put a knife through you, but it really won't happen. That's the only reason I can think of how to explain why they didn't flinch with a knife. Every normal person, when the knife goes through, is going to flinch back. They didn't do so. Now, you'll notice that in every case, the video was cut before the beheading. And then you see the beheading on a table later on at some time. What I think this means is that the operatives which rescued them got them to do the video, cut the film at that, and then beheaded them later, and they were betrayed. That's what I think happened. That's how ruthless these black operations are that are also responsible for the 9/11 attack on New York. Operation from beginning to end.
This is some information that's been coming around online. It's definitely been floating around the Middle East, is the fake beheadings. Now, there have been countless videos that's been released of actual beheadings. I think we can say that there are some real beheadings out there, but the ones that you're talking about with the orange jumpsuits, we're going to show that right now. That has been what has been deemed a conspiracy for so long, but I think what you say is very clear that these were staged. So I find that interesting. I want you to go into that a little bit more. And something else that you mentioned that has gained a lot of attention online, something that has spread a little bit in the Middle East, but not too much, is the fact that Mossad agents are training ISIS members and ISIS leaders. And I'm sure you know the well-known picture where Senator John McCain is posing with the kidnappers, and that was floating around the internet for some time. And the man that's standing behind McCain that people say is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So I want to know if that's the case, if you, with a man of your experience and expertise, if you have come across any information to confirm that is actually Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, that Senator McCain was going out, meeting with these rebels, these liberators of Syria, how many times he was actually meeting with ISIS members, and if Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was there, actually was trained by Western and intelligence and Mossad, because there's always been this whisper, at least in certain circles, that these terrorist camps, you know, these Abu Ghraibs and prisons that we never even hear of, are almost universities for these terrorists. So if you've come across any information like that you can share with us, I know a lot of viewers would be interested in that.
Well, I don't have any inside information. You know, In fact, I don't even trust anyone who claims to be an insider, because with total NSA spying going on, you couldn't be an insider and be leaking to our side of the political spectrum without being caught. And so this ubiquitous Q, Mr. Q, who is all over the internet claiming to be an insider, you know, I just don't believe it. Sure, they may give a little bit of truth out here, but it's only to hook people on things. So I don't have insider sources to confirm that. All I do know is that in terms of the terrorists, there's no difference. They're all believers in mandatory Sharia law. They're all for imposition of Sharia law by force. So there is no difference between ISIS, other than the fact that ISIS was directed to be, and only the leaders knew that, to be the most ruthless of all terrorist organizations in order to gin up the war on terror, which was sagging after 9/11 so many years and so many terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda. And now ISIS is going to go by the wayside. I don't know what they're going to have in response, but I can tell you that it's looking like Iran is going to be the new boogeyman in Syria, or in the Middle East. And I think that they have Assad sufficiently in a box in terms of fighting for his own survival that they can go ahead and do this attack on Iran. And they're going to do it by the Israelis starting, not by attacking Iran proper, but by attacking Iran in Syria, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I think the U.S. will come in as well to try to get Iran to attack something in the U.S. so that they can justify a full-blown attack on Iran. Now, the problem with all this is that Russia's still there. The reason Russia has not retaliated against Turkey or even the United States rebels who have used a handheld anti-aircraft missile to bring down a Russian aircraft is that the Russians really don't want to provoke a World War III. They're not ready yet. They are in Syria basically to embarrass the U.S., to put them on the defensive for their phony war on terror and to save Assad. But they don't want World War III yet. And that's the whole reason, switching subjects briefly, for this new peace offensive in North Korea. They knew that Trump was, in fact, going to attack North Korea. North Korea has been preserved as a trigger event for World War III, and that's why no U.S. puppets of the globalists, has ever pushed North Korea. But Trump was threatening to set off this trigger event earlier than what Russia and China were ready. And that's why Kim came out and said, you know, I'll even give up my nuclear weapons, something he vowed even the month before never to do. Sure. And the reason has to be that China, with their agents in the U.S., was convinced Russia is going to attack. It's going to use up this trigger event too early. You need to do anything possible, Kim, to stop him from attacking. I don't care what you have to give, but you need to switch sides and start to negotiate. Now, it's going to be a phony thing anyway. North Korea is not going to disarm. And in fact, the U.S. only has some 6 or 9 months before North Korea solves the two major problems that they have yet to solve, is complete miniaturization of a weapon to put on a warhead and to have a warhead that survives reentry, the heat of reentry. Every one of their missiles have burned up upon reentry. So they haven't got a missile that can threaten the world yet. But CIA Director Mike Pompeo thinks they're within 6 to 9 months from doing that. So anyway, that's the globalist perspective, why Russia is still kind of bending over backwards to take some losses. And the U.S. is going to push Russia further and further to see how much they're going to take, because they need to know that before they launch a full-scale attack of Iran, whether or not Russia is going to intervene militarily to stop them. The Russia has S-400 systems in Syria. They could shoot down U.S. aircraft. Notice that they're not doing any of that. It's not that they can't, but somehow I think they do not want an expanded war, and so they're playing it carefully.
Certain members of Chinese government speaking with the United States, Kim's not going to do that. It's not time. Russia's not ready. is it true that this globalist agenda, that, each world leader is being portrayed as, a good guy, a bad guy, an aggressor, someone who is coming in, someone who's just defending themselves? Are they all just global players in some huge theater? Or are they actually, you hear rumors that they're actually just buddies in the back room overseeing all of this?
No, there are 3 separate predator centers in the world, in my opinion. There is the Anglo-American globalists, which we're dealing with, Russia and China. They're separate predator centers. Each of these 3 centers intends to establish their own global government with them in control. Right now, the Russians and Chinese are allied loosely in order to take down the West. They are planning a preemptive nuclear strike on the West when they're ready. And I don't think they're ready until the middle of the next decade. Their newest weapon systems aren't coming into serial production until 2021, 22, 23, and 24. So while they might be foolish enough to start a war earlier than that, you really need a blue water navy that's big enough to control all of the territory that you occupy during a war. It isn't enough to nuke the world, which doesn't happen anyway. Russia and China do not intend to nuke cities. Remember, they're taking down the bully of the world, the U.S. They're not wanting to become the bully of the world, and so they're going to hit U.S. and British military targets only, and then try to blackmail the West into submission. That's their plan. Now, the U.S. globalists know that. They've got spies in Russia and China, and they know that. And so it's my theory that the U.S. intends to absorb that nuclear first strike, and in order to be able to see the military decapitated, that's the only way they can talk Americans into joining a globalized or a militarized global government, by allowing the U.S. military to be decapitated. Now, how do I know that? What's the basis of the theory? The basis is a secret presidential decision directive, 1997, called PDD 60. Presidential Decision Directive 60 was a total revamp of our nuclear weapons posture during the Clinton administration. It directs our military forces to not rely on launch on warning, but to be prepared to absorb a nuclear first strike and then retaliate afterwards. Now, if anybody knows what launch on warning is, it means that when our satellites detect missiles launching, we launch our missiles before their missiles arrive. So the one who launches second is the one who wins, because the first missiles hit empty silos. The missiles that launch second hit live targets. Okay. Now, that isn't totally true, because you can't evacuate military bases and they'll be hit. So we'll lose a lot of our military bases. In fact, there are about 15 major cities in the U.S. that will be hit in that first strike, because the military bases are integral to the city, like San Diego, Seattle, Omaha, Nebraska, Colorado Springs, Norfolk, Virginia, Jacksonville, Florida, Washington, D.C. So there will be some casualties. I expect that first strike will take about 20 million people dead. But, our leaders are ruthless enough to have allowed, to have actually planned, invoked Japan or provoked Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. We lost 3,000 there. They planned and executed 9/11 to blame it on Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden when it was a U.S. black operation. So these are ruthless people. They care nothing for lives. But they are building deep underground bunkers, new ones, not just Mount Weather and other things that we've known about for a long time. They know the Russians know about that. They know that they'll be hit. They've got a lot of new underground bunkers being built because they know this nuclear attack is coming and they intend to let it fall.
Well, Joel, I want to talk to you about that really quick. You're speaking as if you, and of course you have the experience, so that's why you've kind of piqued my curiosity. You're speaking as if you already see this happening. The way you're talking, it's as if you can already see this going down. And, you know, of course, you know, God knows best the time, but, you know, you see this happening sometime in our lifetime. That's the feeling I get. And I've heard a lot about these underground military bases, what do they call them, DUMBs, or, you know, you hear a lot about these underground tunnel networks that they're building all across the country that's leading to different military facilities. What have you heard about that?
Well, I don't believe all that I've heard on that, because they claim, I mean, if you had what they claim to be underground tunnels linking everywhere around there, you know, done by nuclear explosion, I mean, still, where do you put the material? It'd be just huge mountains of material. Now, certain pseudoscientists have claimed they've got nuclear Boeing machines that just make the material disappear. I just am not buying that. Now, there are underground bunkers and systems, but I don't know of huge, long-distance tunnels connecting them. I don't think those are necessary. But I do know this. The globalists are not stupid. They don't intend to absorb a nuclear first strike. And you might ask, if you let the U.S. and British military be decapitated in the first strike, how do you win a third world war against Russia and China?
Exactly.
Well, I think, very frankly, the U.S. has a lot of secret weapon systems being built that they do not intend to use or bring out to stop this attack, but they'll bring it out afterwards. For example, you know, Area 51 has multiple underground huge tunnel facilities. There's over 30,000 people that bus or fly out there every day to work at Area 51. Now, they're not just diddling around with a UFO crash or little things like that. I mean, they're building, you know, the stealth fighter was developed out there. There's all kinds of missile and anti-missile and aircraft being developed out there. I believe that, in fact, the Star Wars system initiated during the Reagan administration actually got built and deployed. I think there are missile interceptors out in space that are much more effective. And, you know, the Russians have just revealed about their new hypersonic warheads. Those are formidable, but those can be interdicted in space before they're launched from that missile. You can hit that missile before it detaches its warheads, and I think that's what the U.S. could do. They won't do it for the first strike because they want the military decapitated so they can come out of their bunkers and say, our only solution now is to join in a military union with all the rest of the world. And who's going to say nay after you've been hit with nuclear weapons? But I think they've got to have a way to stop further attacks so they don't have to succumb to Russian and Chinese blackmail. They can say, screw you, we're going to fight. I also believe, this is my own personal theory, based upon what happened in World War II, I think the globalists will make a deal with the Chinese during World War III to betray Russia. Now, China always knows that they got to take down both the West and Russia in order to rule. Russia knows they got to take down the West and China to rule. China is much more powerful now than Russia, although Russia is technologically ahead of China. Is still, if China turned against Russia, Russia would be fighting a two-front war just like Hitler, and he can't win. So I think in World War III, Russia goes down, and there's only two predator centers left. There's China and the globalists. And I think they want to have a Russian Cold War, a Chinese Cold War threat, because then that justifies not giving back individual national sovereignty anymore. It justifies keeping a militarized global government because you got this big threat of China facing you after the war. That's what they did in World War II with backing Russia. They built Russia. They gave Russia the nuclear plans to weapons that they couldn't steal from the Manhattan Project through Lend-Lease. A year after the war, they gave them the first shipment of enriched uranium so that they could explode their first nuclear weapon. Russians didn't know how to do enrichment. But they exploded their first nuclear weapon a year after Hiroshima because of U.S. aid. So the U.S. globalists, even then, were building future enemies to create this conflict, culminating in this great war. You know, World War II brought us a global government, but it has no teeth. It's just all voluntary. So they needed one more war in order to give us a global government that has teeth, that has military power, that has taxation power, that has control. And they'll tell you you're free, just like the EU has in their constitution. You have all the right to free speech, except you have all these caveats, except when the public interest, decrees that you have to give up this right. That's the way that globalist constitutions are written. There's a big backlash against globalism throughout the world. But you see how they're so expert at deceiving the people. Prime Minister May claiming that I am going to make sure this Brexit happens, and she is sabotaging it every single day in secret agreements with the EU. She had the British Parliament enact all EU law into British law as a condition of leaving the EU. So what's the reason for the Brexit if you're going to enact and put into British law all EU law? That's why people wanted out of the EU. I mean, this is the kind of betrayal that's going on. She's just signed a secret agreement that all British military funds will be subservient to a new EU army. They're planning on disbanding NATO and going with a separate EU army. And I think that's the basis of what this new globalist military will be after the U.S. military is hit with a nuclear first strike.
What you're saying has huge implications for Americans. I know I have a lot of family in America, and a lot of people are talking about this international globalist takeover. And when I hear you talking about this scenario of potential nuclear attack on military establishments, but I don't know what you'd call it, the globalists inside the American government allowing that to happen, almost seemingly wanting that to happen. Of course, everybody knows now that, I hope a lot of people know now that 9/11 was a false flag attack. So we've seen these events like this being allowed to take place, not really any concern for human life for citizens. And you hear that this international globalist takeover is picking up steam with operations being undergoing in the United States. And I came across an executive order from Obama that he signed back in 2010, and I wanted to get your opinion on it. It was called the Council of Governors, and it was saying that in the event of a nuclear attack or a natural disaster or anything of the sort, that the continent would be split up into 10 mega regions. And I caught an interview that you gave with Alex Jones, and you were talking about the dark side of the government, and you were talking about how some of these, a lot of the military leaders and the political officials all over the world were almost prepped and trained at Georgetown University. And I found the connection very interesting, because it appears, or it seems, that a lot of the Georgetown-trained officials are Jesuit in nature. I mean, I can say that safely through the research over the last years, that a lot of them seem to be Jesuit in nature. And when I started looking at these 10 mega regions, it appears that these 10 governors that are supposed to oversee these regions are actually kind of Jesuit in nature too. And then I start looking at this international globalist takeover that everybody talks about, how the United Nations keep going into the United States. They already have vehicles and military equipment there. There are, you hear the Chicago governor, for example, calling for the potential of UN peacekeeping missions actually in the city of Chicago. A lot of strange things. So when we're talking about globalists, and correct me if I'm wrong on these things, and if we're talking about globalists, we're outside of the American government. I'm trying to get people to understand in America and even outside of America, who are these people? You mentioned that NATO will be disbanded and it will go into a European Union military. Who exactly are the faces or the colors or the places that are behind this movement?
Well, only people like Henry Kissinger know who's at the top. None of them take public positions like Kissinger, but he is the top globalist advisor to the United States anyway. And the reason we know that is because General James Jones, first national security advisor under Barack Obama, at the Munich Security Conference in 1997, I believe, said this. It followed an evening where they'd given a special award to Henry Kissinger. So the following morning, James Jones gives up to give his talk and says, I want to say a few remarks about Henry Kissinger. We at the National Security Council, he said, have a hierarchy. We get our daily marching orders from Henry Kissinger passed down through Brent Scowcroft or Sandy Berger. Mm-hmm. Now, that's proof of a conspiracy because Henry Kissinger has no legal right to be giving suggestions, let alone daily marching orders to the National Security Council of the President of the United States. But it proves my point that the globalists do, in fact, direct U.S. foreign policy through people that they control in each of these. And that's why when President Trump was elected, a non-globalist, he's not a puppet, but he's easy to manipulate because he doesn't have the background or experience to even know who's deep state and who isn't. For example, he fired James Comey, who was deep state, and he named Christopher Wray, who's also deep state, to be the new FBI director. Was involved in the Enron cover-up. He was involved in 9/11, worked with Robert Mueller, who's deep state. And you have Rod Rosenstein, in the Department of Justice controlling everything. So you see, Trump is really out of his league. He really cannot handle this. Even a person who knew it would be very, very difficult because of the amount of control that the deep state has. It would be very difficult to oust them, especially since they control the judges and about 75% of Congress.
Could you address the rumors? I don't know if you call them rumors, theories, but there seems to be a lot of them about Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, because when I was watching his moves, I mean, it was strange to me. I mean, this is a guy in his young 30s. Of course, he has a lot of connections in marketing and finances. He has a business that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and of course, he was connected. But I found it strange that he went out to Saudi Arabia days before this purge. You heard in the news, there's a purge, a royal purge, a Saudi purge, purge. And it was strange to me that, Kushner went out there. He visited with Mohammed bin Salman. It was kind of an unannounced visit. They stayed up late hours of the night. He comes back days later. Bin Salman is basically ridding all opposition that was opposing his sudden rise to power. And you look at all these pictures and these videos, and Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman seem to be pretty close. They seem to be pretty comfortable around each other. So when I look at that, and then I see stories that perhaps Kushner is like a protege to Henry Kissinger. Have you heard of anything like this? Like he's almost like an intern, if you will, that's kind of been brought into the White House, kind of Israeli-backed.
I have heard the rumors, but they're not true. In fact, Kushner is laughed at in the foreign policy establishment. He has no experience. He doesn't know what he's doing. The only calling card he has is, I'm the son-in-law of the president. The only reason people are dealing with him is because it's their way to communicate with a president they don't know, they don't trust. But I'll tell you, Kushner hasn't accomplished one single thing in any of those trips overseas. He's 30 years old. He simply doesn't have the experience. He he's never studied what these other countries do. And it's just a joke in Washington when you send Kushner out to Beijing or to Saudi Arabia, etc. He's going to be played because he doesn't know what he's doing. Now, it's true that he's got his Israeli connections, but they play him as well. There's a lot of rumors about Israel, for example, that a lot of people think that Israel controls the U.S., but I've determined that's not true. The Israelis are a major arm of the globalist. In fact, the CIA uses the Mossad to do all of their international assassinations and hits because they're much better than the CIA, especially in the foreign element. But the Israelis, for example, have been given permission by the U.S. to resell U.S. technology to China for a profit. And the U.S. can't get caught selling technology directly to China anymore. They did during the Clinton administration through the Commerce Department. A lot of that got shut down. But now they do it through Israel. They give aid and technological transfers to Israel, and then Israel sells to China for a profit. So, there are an awful lot of Jews involved in globalism, I will admit. But it isn't what I call a Zionist conspiracy. You know, Zionism has something to do with the restoration of the house of Israel from biblical prophecies. These globalist Jews are not religious at all. They despise their own Jewish religion. So this is not a religious Zionism in any case whatsoever. If anything, it is a political Zionism, which in its days in the 1940s, when it took over Israel, was a communist front. Mm-hmm. I mean, these were communists from Russia. There was a communist from Eastern Europe. They were Jews. They believed in this full form of socialism. The Histadrut controlled all of the labor unions in Israel, ran it with an iron rod. You had all of these communes. I mean, this was a communist society. And it's so it's not religious in that sense. And so I prefer to attack globalists because that includes all the bad Jews and it doesn't defend the good Jews when you attack globalists.
I'm glad you mentioned this, Joel, and I think this is something that's very, very important for this region, and I think I really want you to shout it loud and very clear, is that a lot of people in the Middle East, and all over the world even, I mean, you find them in the United States, especially after 9/11, there's a lot of evidence that proves that Israel, along with the United States, I think a big joint effort, but Israel had a big part to play in 9/11. I think that's very clear now when you look at the evidences. And people have kind of latched on to these certain instances, you know, certain things that Israel have done over the past. They take that, and everything in the world is Zionism. Zionist, the Zionists did it, the Zionists did it, the Zionists did it. And it's bigger than that, isn't it? And I think that's very important for you to explain to us that it's not about a Zionist movement. I can see it very clearly that the United States have much more influence and control over the world than Israel does in this global scheme of things. That it's almost become this Luciferian, totalitarian, mixed, just add whatever word you want to. But Zionist definitely is not the word when you're talking about this, you know, quote-unquote New World Order, this globalist agenda.
Yeah, I don't believe it's a Zionist. I think that there are many Jews that are part of the globalist connection because they're drawn to the halls of power. You know, smart people who are relatively unprincipled want to be part of the power structure, and that's what draws them to it. Well, I mean, take Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel. He's a Kissinger protege. Kissinger and Associates paid for his education, his Ivy League education in the United States. They set him up in his first Wall Street business in order to make him wealthy. They set him up in politics in Israel by sending him back to Israel, and he immediately organized a major international counterterrorism conference to which Henry Kissinger came, past presidents of the United States came. And so in Israel, any young kid, and he was in his 30s then, you know, who can bring in these really heavy hitters to Israel has to be a hero, and he instantly became a political success. That's how they promote people. But he masquerades as right-wing, pro-settler, but he will sell out settlers just like Ariel Sharon did and everyone else eventually. But, you know, this is a very sophisticated deception when you claim to be part of someone, to be like you. And, you know, it's wolf in sheep's clothing. And I sound the whistle loud and clear that this is not a Jewish conspiracy. There are a lot of Jews involved, but these are unprincipled Jews who don't believe in either religious Zionism or national sovereignty, and they're really globalists. So that's how I feel about it. And, you know, they have a great deal of power in the United States, and part of that power came because of the Holocaust. You'll notice that during the Holocaust, which really did happen, although certain things were exaggerated, like the use of gas chambers, there was some of that, but very little of it compared to the amount of millions that died from disease. Numbers were slightly exaggerated as well. But the biggest thing about the Holocaust is that the U.S. and British people let it happen. They refused to take Jewish refugees. They refused to let them escape. They wanted the Holocaust to happen. And why do globalists want that? Because there are a lot of Jews involved in globalism. They wanted to make, in my opinion, a sacrosanct class of people that was beyond criticism. So now you can't criticize any Jew because you're then said you're anti-Semitic, sure, even if they deserve criticism for their actions. You know, the ADL is famous for that. You know, just as soon as you criticize anyone as Jew, you must be anti-Semitic. It's just like Hillary Clinton. If you criticize immigrants, you've got to be racist. If you don't like refugees, you have to be racist. This type of evil misuse of language is very, very important to globalists. And there's very little defense when you have a media that's controlled by them and that propagates this misuse of this political correctness.
Something that, you always hear that saying, follow the money, and I've been trying to use that in regards to research, but I've also found that follow the supporters is a good way to figure out what in the world's going on in this globalist agenda, and there's sure a lot of them. And I want to talk about some of the countries in this Middle Eastern region. And
before you go there, let me just talk about follow the money.
Okay.
This is not an international banking conspiracy per se.
Okay.
It's true that the top international bankers are involved because they're allowed to get wealthy because of their collusion with government, being insiders like that. But remember, these people are already the most wealthy people in the world. How much more wine, women, and songs, second houses, yachts, and other things and jets can you use? The motivation is no longer money. Money is part of what oils their allegiance and their participation. You got to make them wealthy. And there's also the immunity factor. You've got to promise these people immunity from prosecution for their many sins, just like the Saudis are promised immunity from discovery of their pedophilia. Mm-hmm. It's just like the Israeli prime ministers are all corrupt, including Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon before him and others, and they're promised immunity. Mm-hmm. You know, he's not been indicted yet. The police have given a saying he should be indicted, but you know, the courts are controlled in Israel, and I think he's going to get off, even though a previous prime minister, was used by them to go to prison for corruption so that they could basically say, you see, the courts aren't controlled. We do prosecute prime ministers, but I think Netanyahu will get off. He may even just pull a war in the Middle East specifically to divert people from impeaching him for president. But so there's this immunity thing which really drives the promise of immunity. And you look at Bill Clinton, I mean, all the sins while in the White House, and he got away scot-free. I mean, look at the cover-up, the murder of Vince Foster, the financial advisor to the Clintons. They ruled it a suicide, even though it was clearly a murder that they had. They get away with this. When people look at them and say, boy, there's real power there. And it was Ken Starr, of course, who was involved in doing the cover-up, a Republican. It was the Republicans who covered up for Bill Clinton in the impeachment and refused to impeach him. So you see, it crosses both party lines. When people see this, they step back and say, look, there's a power system there, and I don't want to tangle with it. Sure. So I would be very clear that there's probably only 500 people that may know the total globalist Third World War agenda to get us out of our sovereignty into global government. It would scare too many people if they really knew. But there are thousands and thousands of people in high places who know there's a power system they dare not criticize or speak above. And they want money, they have their corruption, they just want to play along, and they don't want to fight for principle. And unfortunately, that's why we're losing this battle, is there's not enough principled people who are willing to stand up and even die against this conspiracy that does have the power to kill.
This power structure, this globalist power structure, you mentioned that they have everything they want, and it's clear. I mean, we know about the 1%. We've heard so much about that. I mean, what else do you want? What else could you want, and what else could you use? So we get that. For one, the first question is, what is the reason? I mean, is it simply this kind of divide and conquer, this power-hungry, take over the world, pinky and brain type stuff? Who's the real masters? Because you hear you hear theories online. There are certain evidences that point towards this kind of Committee of 300, Council of 13 type people. And even if these things can't be confirmed completely, I mean, it can certainly say that there are some aristocratic type families that are certainly influential in this globalist agenda and certain key players around the world. So that would be my first question is, who's the real master of them? This whole Luciferian scenario, this operation that they're carrying out, and what's their end game? What's their total their goal there?
Well, I can't answer that without indulging a little bit of theology, because you see, it's impossible for one corrupt man to set this in motion. It's been going on for 3 centuries at least. All right. How does one man corrupt keep something going and driving an agenda that in fact causes people to have to destroy their own wealth? Like in World War II, they got all these Wall Street people to invest in Hitler and saw it all destroyed. How do you talk people into that? You don't. What you do is, this is a system built upon promises, and because of its transgenerational effect, that is hundreds of years without a hiccup, just continuing to progress along this, creating wars, talking people into things, creating war conflict, talking them into, even destroying people's wealth, it can only be explained by the fact that this is a satanic, Luciferian revelatory process at the very top. Certainly not many people know that. But you know, this is so evil, so sophisticated in its deception. I don't know of any people I know that are that evil, that are capable of monitoring and moving this kind of a system forward generation after generation. I mean, Brzezinski's dead now. I mean, and it still keeps going. Kissinger will be dead, and someone will take his place, and it still keeps going. A mafia family, for example, can't keep their own personal mafia going past 2 generations. This has been going on for 300 years at least, and probably since the beginning of the earth. But what I'm saying, this is a conspiracy power. And there is, in fact, if you can indulge me a little bit, there's a very interesting scriptural insight to the satanic thing that we're talking about, the Luciferian control. It's in Isaiah chapter 14. Okay. And Isaiah sees a vision of these, all the great men of the earth are in prison, in hell, in chains. And they're wondering when someone's going to come and save them. And then they see him who was going to thrash the world descend in chains, and they say, art thou become low like unto us? Now, I think what Isaiah was saying or seeing was, in fact, what the Faustian pact has been all through the ages. The promise of Lucifer that if you help me create my kingdom, destroy God, destroy goodness, etc., I will give you immunity, not only on earth from your sins, but also from the chains of hell. Because you'll never have to face hell if you help me destroy God's work in his kingdom and enthrone me. And so you see, Isaiah sees all the great men who apparently had taken this pact. You don't get to be in great, powerful positions in this world without taking this pact with Satan. But they still go to hell, but they're all talking among themselves and waiting. But he promised he was going to come and save us from hell. And they see him descend in chains, art thou become low like unto us. And they're shocked. They realize the jig is up. He's not going to be able to save them. I think that's a marvelous prophetic vision.
No, it is.
And it bespeaks of this motivation. You say, what motivates this? At the very top, it's people who have supreme confidence. You follow us in our power, and we will promise you immunity, not only in this earth, but the earth to come. They don't all get any revelation from Satan, but I think the very top people do. Just as God can occasionally speak to a prophet, I think Satan has the power to speak to his own.
I talked to you a little bit before we started.